NASA says that right now is a breathtaking basic chance to zero in on the world Venus. This follows the new exposures of conceivable life on the planet. In the event that you somehow wind up researching NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the space organization calling Venus a planet of judgment. In the meantime, Mars became our essential objective. Such careful naming of the primary planets wasn't ordinary during the wild space race period. The Soviet Union was centered around sending sea missions to Venus. The stunning planet showed for all intents and purposes no potential for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. Thanks to Neil deGrasse Tyson, we finally figure out why. Go along with us as we look at the declassified photographs from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was huge in more ways than one. Not only did it change the global course of the world, but the breakdown of the USSR also sealed away numerous insider secrets. The truth that the Soviets had a deep propensity for maintaining secrets, from running the most subtle intelligence organization in the world to being baffling about their actual abilities, suggests that extraterrestrial contact was one of those mysteries. The former superpower holds numerous untold secrets. Before the US outperformed general planetary missions in space, the Soviet Union was leading the game. While the USSR had a long history of both successful and failed space missions, its most renowned focus was on the very antagonistic planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd see Venus as Venera, which is also the name of the mission that endured from 1961 to 1983. During the same time, the US was caught up in sending its missions to the moon. In a manner, the Soviets chose to use their assets elsewhere. We can't say that the entire fixation on the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets want to utilize the planet's surface as a potential power station? Or were they perhaps hoping to colonize the planet? After searching for any signs of activity beneath the surface, the question remains, why were the Soviets so focused on this fierce planet? As they completed these missions during the Cold War, they weren't totally open about their objectives. In fact, all that we know about the Venusian missions comes from declassified and unarchived data. All things considered, after so much effort pinpointing what is testing, the Soviets were genuinely searching for and whether they ever uncovered the mysteries of Venus. The Soviets didn't land on Venus once or even twice, but commonly that is true. The Soviets launched 28 expensive rockets toward the planet. In addition, 13 of those entered the Venusian air, while 8 actually landed. Such complex missions put the Soviets in a leading position in space exploration. Sure, the US was a close second, but NASA was more focused on satellites and creative technology than on looking for life on other planets. Their attention was on Mars, which in turn wasn't especially strange or particularly terrible. Your history books may not tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth. It also had another set of firsts to its name. The USSR became the first country to achieve a soft landing on another planet, returning pictures and sounds from the surface of that planet. In fact, the Soviets had their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind moment a long time before the US. So why do we seldom hear about such accomplishments? Well, remember what we said about the Soviet inclination for maintaining secrets. That is only one of many explanations for the oversight of the Soviet space program. In 1992, the notable organization was decommissioned following the breakdown of the USSR, and the program had to be resurrected under a new Russian identity, Roscosmos. Many of its original records were either lost or destroyed. This is exactly why we don't have a clear answer about why the Soviets launched 28 rockets into Venus's air. Still, we can make the most sensible assumption. Perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about cost-effectiveness than anything else. It's not to say that the space program didn't recognize the planet's genuine potential. They were searching for reasonable water levels, sunlight radiation, and the general characteristics of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been extraordinarily difficult to assess Venus' high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Today, many astronomers don't believe that the unfriendly planet could support life. The temperatures there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce. Also, because of its thick climate, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is multiple times that of Earth. Anyway, there are still ongoing advancements, and to overlook the USSR's contribution to the investigation of Venus is to re-examine history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth investigating. Even though filling the space race by looking at other more accommodating planets like Mars wasn't completely out of the question, it was more expensive than sending probes to Venus. Everything basically comes down to the distance from Earth to another celestial body. On average, the antagonistic planet is just 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars is on average 250 million kilometers away. Such huge differences in distance result in massive differences in cost. Had the US not been the world's largest economy, it may have never even explored Mars with such ease. Different reports suggest that Soviet missions were hazardous and had significant technical gaps. Of course, the rockets weren't able to cover huge distances. Besides, the organization had a poor history of losing contact with its rockets, so it makes sense why the Soviet space program picked a more practical and relatively closer mission that would yield results. Anyway, if we don't think about the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The US wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move kicked off the space race and kept its momentum. What's especially interesting is the reason the US focused on the Moon instead of Venus. NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s, and consequently, the US Space Organization hit a detour known as the Venus Curse. Each time they launched a probe into Venus' atmosphere, it failed. This was precisely when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to exploit NASA's failures. Around that time, both the US and the USSR were determined to win the space race. The best strategy was to take advantage of two particular opportunities. It was a quiet yet decisive methodology. The Soviet space program seized Earth's sister planet as its first triumph in the space race, accomplishing something its principal rival had failed to do. Notwithstanding the Soviet Union's limited resources and faltering government, they repeatedly launched missions to Venus to maintain their leading position over the US. Unlike NASA's focus on the Moon, this vital decision wasn't without hostility. Moreover, shrewd publicity was used to cloud their significant failures with Venus. The American government was prompted to investigate the USSR's obsession with the planet, with the media labeling Venus the hostile planet, while Mars became humanity's fate. These names didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to show their superiority over the Americans, and they succeeded in doing so. The Venera missions are almost forgotten in modern history. However, despite their early troubles, these missions were incredibly refined, advanced, and aggressive at the beginning of the space age. The Venera missions led the way. Back in the 1950s, the Soviets started testing the designs and technical details of the probes. Over the next 30 years, they proceeded to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program ran alongside a brutal Cold War, the Soviets focused on improving their resources. Luckily for them, the early years of the conflict gave them more resources than the US, which turned out to be highly significant. It allowed them to build larger rockets designed to break through high altitudes and cover tremendous distances. The Soviets raced to experiment with both manned and unmanned rockets, while the Soviet intellectual community worked on a series of calculations and assessments to chart accurate routes for the Venus missions. In the background, their Mars programs were also running. Nothing was more important than developing advanced instrumentation for these missions. This led to major breakthroughs in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and successfully land on the planet's surface. This achievement escalated the competition between the two superpowers. Unlike the American missions, which were plagued by failures and losses, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite their triumphs, the USSR managed to send successful probes into Venus' atmosphere. The main point of conflict with this approach was the limited design capabilities. The Soviets quickly overcame their design issues and launched the most advanced probes of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their pioneering efforts allowed them to achieve the first simultaneous launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most history specialists, this was the most significant decade in the history of space exploration. In reality, the US tried to develop similar launch strategies. So why did the Soviet organization choose simultaneous launches into Venus? To understand this, you need to recognize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to collect the highest level of data and evidence. The probes were initially launched to study the planet's surface, and that is exactly what occurred with Venera 4. Since the launch went flawlessly, the probe successfully entered Venus' atmosphere. The Soviet program then went on with Venera 5. But this wasn't just a repeat mission. The real breakthrough came when the device successfully carried data back to Earth. Keep in mind, the Venus surface was a virtual furnace. Of high temperatures, the probe data indicated 460 degrees Celsius. Venera 7 was even more important as it survived over 23 minutes on Venus, sending a series of valuable readings back. These figures informed the design of subsequent probes. The Venera 8, 9, and 10 all followed suit, and by 1975, the Venera 9 sent back the first photographs of Venus' surface. The images were spectacularly grainy and black and white, but they were a milestone in planetary exploration. These were the very first photographs of Venus, an extraordinary feat. In fact, the Soviet program continued to work on the planet until 1983. To this day, Roscosmos is still commemorating the incredible milestones these missions set. The Soviet Union's Venera program left a lasting legacy in the history of space exploration, primarily due to its groundbreaking achievements in Venus exploration. After launching its first mission to Venus in the early 1960s, the Soviet Union's relentless pursuit of understanding the planet stood in stark contrast to the United States' focus on lunar exploration. The USSR's emphasis on Venus highlighted its determination to claim space exploration victories that would solidify its global dominance during the Cold War. Despite the harsh conditions on Venus, including extreme heat, crushing pressure, and a toxic atmosphere, the Soviets succeeded where many other space agencies would eventually fail. By the mid-1970s, the Venera missions had transformed the Soviet Union into a leader in interplanetary exploration. The combination of technical advancements and the determination to keep ahead of the US space program made the Venera missions crucial to the Soviet strategy. The successful landing of Venera 7 in 1970, which transmitted data for 23 minutes before succumbing to the harsh conditions of the surface, marked a turning point. It showed that it was possible to land on and gather meaningful data from Venus, a feat no other space program had achieved before. The success of Venera 7 emboldened the Soviet Space Agency to send even more ambitious probes in the years that followed. Venera 9, launched in 1975, achieved another milestone by sending the first clear images of Venus' surface. These photographs, although grainy, were invaluable, providing the world with a visual record of the planet's bleak, rocky landscape. The images showed a desolate world with rocky plains and sparse, jagged terrain, revealing nothing resembling the Earth-like conditions some had imagined. Instead, the surface of Venus was revealed as a harsh, hostile environment, with volcanic plains and an atmosphere thick with sulfuric acid clouds. These findings, along with temperature and atmospheric pressure data, gave scientists invaluable information about the nature of Venus and its uninhabitable conditions. The Venera 10, which followed shortly after, further cemented the Soviet Union's position as a pioneer in planetary exploration. It continued the work of its predecessors by transmitting additional data and refining the measurements of Venus' atmosphere, surface conditions, and geology. Each mission revealed more about Venus' inhospitable environment, helping to dispel earlier myths and contributing significantly to planetary science. By the time the Venera program concluded in the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had sent 13 probes to Venus, with 8 of them successfully landing or transmitting data from the planet's atmosphere. These achievements were significant, especially considering the technological limitations of the time. The probes were equipped with instruments designed to withstand extreme heat and pressure, and their ability to transmit data under such conditions was a triumph of engineering. Despite the challenges, the Soviet Union's dedication to Venus exploration resulted in one of the most successful interplanetary missions in history. While the Venera program was winding down in the 1980s, NASA's focus shifted to Mars, and the US largely abandoned efforts to explore Venus. NASA's earlier attempts to send probes to Venus had been thwarted by the so-called Venus curse, with each mission failing due to the planet's extreme conditions. This curse meant that the U.S. Space Agency was slow to embrace Venus as a primary target for exploration, while the Soviet Union had already established its dominance in Venusian exploration. It wasn't just the technological success of the Venera missions that made them important. They were also part of a broader strategy by the Soviet Union to demonstrate its superiority in space, especially after the U.S. had successfully landed astronauts on the Moon. The USSR's ability to continue sending successful probes to Venus while the U.S. struggled with its Venus missions allowed it to claim a significant victory in the space race. This ongoing rivalry drove the U.S. to focus on more distant targets, like Mars, while the Soviet Union pressed forward with its studies of Venus. In hindsight, the Venera missions served as a crucial foundation for future exploration of the planet. In the decades since, other space agencies have attempted to revisit Venus, but few missions have been able to rival the Soviet achievements. The Venera program's success, coupled with its dedication to pushing the boundaries of what was possible in space exploration, ensured that it would remain a key chapter in the story of humanity's exploration of our solar system.